So God has made 5 covenants with His people, and each covenant has found its fulfillment in Jesus. That's the big idea, the overall thing that we want to see tonight. And we're going to walk through these 5 covenants. You're going to be familiar with most of these stories and many of these passages, but you probably haven't thought of them in the idea of covenant. And I want to kind of help you put these together and see the picture of how the Bible is really the story of God making one covenant after another and fulfilling those covenants and working those covenants out with His people. So we're going to start with the Noahic covenant. Genesis chapter 6 verse 18 is the first time in the Bible the word covenant is used. I will establish my covenant with you, speaking to Noah and his sons. Now there are those who believe that there are covenants that precede the covenant with Noah. And most likely we could consider these rightly as covenants. So God's covenant, some say with Adam. God made a covenant with Adam when He said, I'll put you in the garden, don't touch the tree. Your part of the covenant is not to eat from the tree. That's your part of the covenant. My part of the covenant is I'm going to put you in the garden to work it, and we will fellowship with one another. And of course that covenant was broken. There are some who say, well, there was a covenant that actually happened before the covenant with Adam, and it was really God's covenant in and of Himself, in and of the Trinity, that where He covenanted, He decided to save humanity, and we ought to consider that a covenant. Personally, I think that is a stretch. I understand the idea of Adam, God making a covenant with Adam, because we have some of the elements there. I do believe God decided to save us. Obviously, we are saved, so God decided to save us. But I think the language of covenant is a little much to apply it there. And there are people who see other covenants. The covenant after Adam comes out of the garden. God does not kill him instantly, so there's some covenant in place there. And again, they kind of put that covenant really within the Trinity. The Trinity decides to give grace, to show grace, instead of killing Adam right away. I prefer not to think of that as covenant. I prefer to think of it more as Adam has violated the covenant, and he is now in the process of dying, and so he's suffering for violating the covenant, and then we're all in some ways suffering from his violation and our own violation of that covenant. So those are just some covenants that kind of come up before the Noahic covenant, but the first time the covenant is used is in connection with Noah. And you all know this. You've heard this since you were a kid. God makes a covenant with Noah, and He says, I will not flood the earth again, and I'll put a rainbow in the sky, and that'll be a reminder to both of us that I will not flood the earth again. I will not destroy the earth with a flood. So that is the covenant that He makes, but there's more to it. So look at Genesis chapter 9, starting in verse 8. You have some of it there in your listening guide, but if you want to turn and follow along, you can do that as well. The Bible says, God said to Noah and his sons with him, Behold, I will establish my covenant with you and your offspring after you. And this is something, the first thing I want you to notice when it comes to covenants. These covenants always apply to the offspring as well. So I'm going to make a covenant with you, Noah, but I'm going to, this will apply to your offspring after you. Now, how many of you here are part of the offspring of Noah? All right, all of you should be raising your hands. Yes, we're all part of the offspring of Noah. God hit the reset button, and Noah and his family repopulated the earth. So this is something that applies to us. But then also He says, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant I make between you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So some people believe, and I don't think, I like this interpretation, that God setting His bow in the cloud is the sign of a warrior putting his bow down. I will set my bow in the cloud. It will be a reminder to you, my bow is no longer in my hand, and so I'm not going to destroy the earth in this manner. And also God says, I will not destroy all flesh in this manner. Sometimes we'll say, well, that doesn't mean that God is not going to destroy the earth. It's just that He's not going to destroy it by water. That's true. That's a good statement to make, that God has said He will remake the earth, and part of that will be a judgment of fire. And how much of that will be a complete destruction and how much of that will be a redemptive process and what all that will look like, we don't know, and we'll only know when God does it. But I also want you to notice that He destroyed all flesh except for the people that He made this covenant with. He made the covenant with them in Genesis chapter 6. That's before the flood. He reiterates the details of this covenant in Genesis chapter 9. That's after the covenant. So again, there is a covenant people of God. Even from this very first covenant that we see in Genesis, there's a covenant people of God, and it's for them and their offspring after them. Then there is the Abrahamic covenant, and this is the covenant that God makes with Abraham. Genesis chapter 12 is the first time God makes a promise to Abraham. So Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, very, very important passage of Scripture. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So we see the idea of His offspring in this. Although the word covenant is not specifically used here, it will be used later in regard to the promises God makes to Abraham. And also the idea of offspring. Even though offspring are not specifically mentioned that the covenant would apply to them, He says, "I'll make of you a great nation." You're going to have a lot of kids. You're going to become a great nation. And then something else that I want you to notice is that just like the Noahic covenant, see how the Noahic covenant is all the earth. The whole earth is going to benefit, Noah, from the covenant that I'm making with you. The same thing is true of Abraham. All the nations of the earth will be blessed because of the covenant I'm making with you. So God's covenant people, God's going to use them. God's going to bless the offspring that come after them. And then because of this covenant that God will keep with Abraham, then all of the earth will be blessed. All the nations of the earth will be blessed. God comes back to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17, and first in Genesis chapter 15. Genesis 15 is that scene where Abraham has a vision, and God commands him to get the animals. He takes the animals, the smaller animals, He puts one on each side. The larger animals, He cuts them in half, and He lays half on one side and half on the other, and He sees a vision of the glory of God coming between those animals as they're laid out. And then God tells him, I will make a covenant with you. And so this is the first time covenant is used in connection with Abraham. It's interesting, according to my Hebrew professor, when you make a covenant, you actually are cutting a covenant. That's the language behind it. You cut a covenant. And so God has him cut these animals in half. Blood is shed. And the same is true with Abraham, by the way, with Noah. Blood is shed there, and animals are sacrificed as that covenant is made. And some rules are laid out for the people there with Noah. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. You shall not shed man's blood by the hand of man, and so on and so forth. So some rules are laid out. With Abraham, He says, "You go to the land I'll show you. I'll make this covenant with you. I'm going to do this thing." And then animals are sacrificed as part of it. So this kind of becomes part of the covenant-making ritual. The covenant with Abraham continues on into chapter 17, and the Bible tells us there in chapter 17, beginning in verse 1, "When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, 'I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly.' Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, 'Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant.'" God goes on to say that they will, that the sign of the covenant will be circumcision, and that He will be their God, and He will give to them Canaan for an everlasting possession. You and your offspring, this is verse 9, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations will keep this covenant. So again, you see that emphasis on offspring, those who are coming after you. So here's what we need to understand. God makes a covenant with Noah, and it applies to his offspring. God makes a covenant with Abraham. It applies to his offspring. We're going to see this pattern continue, and then we're going to see something amazing in the New Testament that, for me, it blows my mind as to how God did this. Then there's the Mosaic covenant. This is one, again, we're very familiar with. This is that picture of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. They come to the foot of Mount Sinai, and God gives them the 10 Commandments, tells them about the tabernacle. He's bringing them into the promised land. What we don't often understand is that God makes a covenant with them at this point. So Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 through 6. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So several things were included in the covenant that God made with His people as far as what He would do for them. However, it is a covenant that is made with the people and their offspring, with the nation corporately. So this is something that would apply to them. And this is a covenant that comes with some rules, right? The 10 Commandments, the tabernacle, the other laws that come along with it. So there's a covenant that comes along with it. This is the Mosaic covenant. We often call it the law. So even the New Testament will call it that, living under the law, or if you're under the law or you're not under the law. Then there's the Davidic covenant. Now this is a covenant you might not be as familiar with, but it is very important. So David is part of the Noahic covenant, right? Because he's part of all the earth. He's part of the Abrahamic covenant because he's a descendant of Abraham. He's part of the Mosaic covenant because he's part of God's people. But you can see these covenants getting more and more specific. So Noah's covenant, everybody. All the offspring of Noah, that's everyone everywhere. Then there's the covenant with Abraham, which is all of Abraham's people. Then there is the covenant with Abraham's people who come into the promised land, and we'll see in the New Testament that this is a covenant that is separate from the Abrahamic covenant, but it's underneath, it's within the Abrahamic covenant. And then there's the Davidic covenant. I really love this story because David, everything is settled, all the wars are fought, he's coming to the end of his reign as king, and he wants to build God a temple, a palace. And he says to Nathan the prophet, he says, I dwell in a palace of cedar. And the word palace and the word temple are the same word. I live in a house. I have a nice house. God lives in a tent. He's still living in the tabernacle. That's the portable temple, made of goat skin, and it's portable. And it's there in Jerusalem, but it's outside. So God's living outside. I'm living in this nice palace. I will build God a house. Nathan says, go for it. Then Nathan goes home that night, and God speaks to Nathan and says, you go back and tell David not to build a house for me. So he goes back and he tells David, God said, don't build a house for me. Your son Solomon's going to do it. But in the middle of that prophecy, what God says to David is he says, you have said you will build a house for me. First of all, I didn't ask you to build a house for me. If I wanted a house all these years, I could have gotten myself a house. This is my paraphrase. But then he says, you will not build me a house. I will build you a house. And let me tell you about the house that I'm going to build you. And then he gives this prophecy. 2 Samuel, we're going to read chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your own body. Now, stop right there. If you go back and read what God said to Abraham, this is very similar wording. We didn't read it, but it's Genesis chapter 15. Abraham goes outside, he looks at the stars, he's in his tent, he says to God, God, you keep saying you're going to do this for me, but I don't even have a child. Everything I own is going to go to Eleazar of Damascus. He's the head servant in my house. He's going to get everything I have when I die. He's my heir. God says, get outside, look at the stars. As numerous as the stars are, that's how many descendants you're going to have, and it will come from your own body. This will come from your own body. So this is the very same language. You can't be a Jewish king and hear this from God and not know He's reminding you of the covenant He made with Abraham. So He says, this who shall come from your own body, and I will establish His kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of His kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. So God promises David that he'll have a throne forever, that a descendant will be on the throne forever. I read last week, and I haven't verified this, so if I'm wrong on this, the source I read is incorrect. But I read that there is no dynasty that has lasted longer, including some of those Chinese dynasties that seem to have lasted for so long, that no dynasty lasted longer than the Davidic dynasty. From the time that David came to the throne until the Babylonian exile is the longest dynasty that we know of any single family ruling in any part of history. Now again, I didn't verify that, but I did read that in a fairly credible source. Either way, it's a long dynasty, but it's not forever, is it? David's eventually, Judah falls, and David doesn't have a king on the throne, but God's made a covenant with him. I'll raise up your offspring. You'll have an eternal kingdom. Your kingdom will last forever. I will build a house for you that is an eternal kingdom. The word covenant is not used there for the Davidic covenant. But Psalm chapter 89 does use the word covenant. This is where I think we might be okay to say that God's deal with Adam, if you will, might be considered a covenant, because God made a promise to Adam, and there were some stipulations that went along with it, and it impacts all of us. So we're all under that covenant because Adam was our federal or representative head. Psalm 89 verses 3 through 4 says, "You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David my servant. I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations." So that tells us that the word covenant, even though it's not directly used there in 2 Samuel, it is still a covenant that God makes with David. This covenant is very important because Solomon comes to the throne, that is David's offspring. He builds the physical house for God. He builds the temple. But then Solomon dies, and here's the thing. The scriptural writers, the prophets, some of the psalmists, the writer of 2 Chronicles, they are all writing after Solomon has died, and they're all saying God is still fulfilling this promise. So we know that this promise, even before Jesus came along, was not limited strictly to Solomon, to David's first son. And eventually it came to be understood that this is going to be passed along to a Davidic Messiah. Now, by the time the New Testament opens, the first century rolls around, there's all kinds of excitement and anticipation that the Davidic Messiah could come at any time. And so Jesus comes onto the scene, and that leads us to the New Covenant. So the New Covenant comes in with Jesus. But here's what I want you to understand. Just like the Noahic covenant is kind of a larger umbrella, the Abrahamic covenant is under that, and the Mosaic covenant, and then the Davidic covenant is under that. The New Covenant is not so much under those other covenants, but it fulfills all of those covenants. So the New Covenant is actually God's way of keeping His word in every other covenant that He has made. So the New Covenant. Jeremiah talks about the New Covenant before we ever get to the New Testament. When we say the words Old Testament and New Testament, what we're really saying is Old Covenant and New Covenant. And Old Covenant refers to the Mosaic Covenant, Old Covenant, and now we've got a New Covenant. So Jeremiah speaks of a new covenant that will be different from the Mosaic covenant. He says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt." That's how we know he's talking about the Old Covenant. "Though I was their husband, declares the Lord, my covenant they broke. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They shall be my people. And no longer shall each teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. So Jeremiah gives this beautiful picture of the new covenant. And keep in mind Jeremiah's setting. Jeremiah is prophesying as the southern kingdom, Judah, is falling apart and heading to exile. And Jeremiah is called the weeping prophet because he tells the great message that God is going to judge Israel and Jerusalem. But in the middle of this judgment, God says, I'm going to make a new covenant with you. And the new covenant will be different from the old covenant in this way. So Jesus institutes that new covenant. When we take the Lord's Supper, we're getting ready for the next 4 weeks as a church. We're going to take the Lord's Supper every Sunday for the next 4 weeks in conjunction with the sermon series that we're going through. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25 says, in the same way, also he took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. The new covenant is here. That covenant that Jeremiah talked about is here, and it is a covenant that is instituted in my blood. So, just like the Noahic covenant and just like the covenant with Abraham and the covenant with Moses, there was sacrifice, there was blood involved, so too there is with the new covenant. And all of God's covenant promises are realized through Jesus. So God's promises are fulfilled in Jesus. He is the long-awaited Messiah. We know that. He's the long-awaited Messiah, but we don't think of that in covenantal language. We don't think of it as being a fulfillment of Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, that through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. God made that promise as in His covenant with Abraham. Now He's fulfilling it in Jesus. He is the ultimate seed of Abraham. That's why Matthew's gospel opens by telling us this is a genealogy about Jesus, who is the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he's making those two covenant connections with us. Isn't he also the son of Adam? Of course he is. Luke traces him back to Adam, but Matthew is telling us these two covenants, the covenant with Abraham and the covenant with David. This is the one who is fulfilling those covenants. This is doing what God promised to do. He is the royal offspring of David. He fulfills the role of Isaiah's servant by redeeming Israel. So Isaiah has a suffering servant. And in conjunction with God's new covenant, how's he going to accomplish all these things? Well, he's going to do it in part through his servant. And here's the interesting thing. As you read about Isaiah's servant, Isaiah begins talking about this servant in the second half of the book of Isaiah, and you trace it. He talks about it in many different places, and it starts out clearly being identified as the nation of Israel. Israel is God's servant, but his servant has failed. And the more that he moves on, two things happen. First of all, Isaiah's servant gets individualized. He starts talking less about corporate Israel, and he starts talking more about a singular servant. And the second thing is the servant himself becomes obedient. So God starts to talk about him in ways where he is obedient and he fulfills and accomplishes what God intends for him to accomplish. Here's the picture we should get from this, and we don't have time to unpack this here, but at some point in the future, I hope we will. What Jesus is, Jesus, yes, is the Messiah, but Jesus is also what sometimes we refer to as true Israel. We might call him a true Israelite, but he's more than that. He is everything Israel was intended to be. That is Jesus. So he lives out the covenant. He lives out the Mosaic covenant. He fulfills it. He is everything that the descendant of Abraham was supposed to be. He is everything that the offspring of David was supposed to be. So he fulfills all of that, and he becomes all of true Israel. So when Jesus says in John chapter 15, verses 1 through 5, I am the vine and you are the branches, he's not just making a really good sermon illustration, although it's a great sermon illustration. I'm the vine, you are the branches. Who is the vine? Israel's the vine. Now, we don't know this for certain, but there's a good chance that Jesus, when he says that, is standing right in front of the temple. He might be in a vineyard, that's one possibility, but he also might be standing right in front of the temple. Why? Because on the front of the temple, there was a carving of a vine, a grapevine. Why? Because Israel is God's vine. And what Jesus is saying is I am replacing. I am here to fulfill, not necessarily to replace. I'm here to restart the chosen people of God. I am the vine. You are the branches. Remain in me. Stay in me. It's also what Jesus has in mind when he starts talking about the temple. Oh, look at this beautiful temple. Jesus says, there'll come a day when one stone won't stand on top of the other. But then he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. Yes, he's talking about his resurrection, but he's also pointing to something. I am here to replace this temple. This temple, you won't need it anymore. Destroy it. Destroy this one. I'll rebuild it. Here's your temple. It's the same thing in John chapter 1. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. Some of your translations actually say that. It is the word tabernacle. God became flesh. The Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. We don't need the temple anymore. The tabernacle, the temple, has come to us in the person of Jesus. So Jesus is replacing everything. He is becoming all Israel as it should have been. Obedient Israel, the Son of God. Who was first called the Son of God? Israel itself. I will be to you a father, and he will be to me a son. That's the offspring, all of David's descendants. They'll be sons of God. So Israel's called that first. David and the kings that followed were called that second, but they never fulfilled it completely. But then Jesus is baptized, and what does God say? This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. This is it. He has come, and He's everything Israel was intended to be. So, God's covenant promises with Abraham, with Noah, with Moses, with David, they all find their fulfillment in Jesus. The new covenant in Jesus replaced the old covenant. This is very important. 20 years ago or so, this was understood in most of the church. Now it's being questioned quite a bit. There are many people who, despite the clear teaching in the New Testament, want to teach that we are somehow under the old covenant. We are not under the old covenant. Time will not allow us to read all the verses in the New Testament that make it crystal clear we are not under the old covenant. We are not under the law. You are not required to eat kosher. You are not required to observe the feasts. You do not have to be circumcised on the 8th day. You do not have to observe Saturday as the Sabbath. We are not under the system of the law anymore. So, just a few verses that will show this. In Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13, in speaking of a new covenant, he quotes Isaiah, that passage in Jeremiah, that passage we read in Jeremiah 31. He quotes it, and then the author of Hebrews says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Galatians chapter 3, verses 16 through 22. This is really interesting because he says the old covenant was kind of a temporary thing. It was actually placed under a larger covenant. It was placed within the covenant made with Abraham. And he says, now the promises were made to Abraham and his offspring. Now watch what Paul is going to do. He says, it does not say, and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. So Paul says, all those years ago, when God said, this is to you and your offspring, that He was talking about Christ. You say, well, what about us? I'm glad you asked. Why do we receive the blessings of the covenant? We receive the blessings of the covenant because we are united with Christ. So, the blessing goes to His offspring, which is the Messiah, and all who are united to Messiah. Those old covenant saints who looked forward to the coming of the Messiah, and the new covenant saints who are looking back to the coming of the Messiah. We are all united in Messiah. And then he says, this is what I mean, the law which came 430 years after does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God so as to make the promise void. So he says, the law can't come along and void the covenant that was made with Abraham. And God made a covenant with Abraham and his offspring, which is a reference to Christ, back to Genesis chapter 12 that says, in you and your offspring all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Galatians chapter 4, I'm not going to read that one, but jot it down for time's sake. You can look it up, Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 26, he makes a clear distinction between the covenants, and he says, do you really want to be under the covenant of the law? You do not want to be under the covenant of the law. You want to be under the new covenant. But then I do want to share with you 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. This is where he contrasts and compares the two covenants. There are other places in Scripture that do this, but I want to read this one to you. It says, now if the ministry of death carved in letters on stone, so what is he talking about? He's talking about the law carved in letters on stone. Paul will be really clear. The law was not bad. The law in and of itself did not bring death. It was our failure to obey the law that brought death. It is the curse that comes with disobedience, and we all disobeyed, so it brought death. Jesus did not disobey. He fulfilled the Mosaic covenant fully, and then his offspring, him being the offspring of all the covenants, receives the promises. Us being united with him receive the promises of the covenants because we are united with Christ, and we receive what he deserves, just as he received what we deserved when he died on the cross. But the ministry of death carved in letters of stone came with such glory that the Israelites could not gaze at Moses' face because of its glory, which was being brought to an end. Which was being brought to an end. Will not the ministry of the Spirit have even more glory? So there's the ministry of law, letters carved in stone, versus the ministry of the Spirit, which is letters written on our heart, the law written on our heart, as Jeremiah spoke about. And it has more glory. So the old one had a lot of glory. Moses' face shone so much that after he visited with God, they couldn't look at him. And so Paul says, listen, if that covenant that's passing away, that faded away, and Moses, when he would meet with God, the glory would shine on his face so much that he would have to put a veil over it, but he would pull the veil off after a few days because it would fade away. And so Paul says, just like that, the glory of the old covenant fades, but the glory of the new covenant does not fade. Actually, what he says just later on in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, he says, actually, we are being created more and more into the image of Christ. The glory of this covenant doesn't fade. The glory of this covenant increases. And so it's a beautiful picture of the covenant. But he goes on, for if there was glory in the ministry of condemnation, the ministry of righteousness must far exceed it in glory. Indeed, in this case, what once had glory has come to have no glory at all because of the glory that surpasses it. For if what was being brought to an end came with glory, much more will what is permanent have glory. Paul says there's nothing wrong with the old covenant. It was filled with glory. But the new covenant is so much more glorious that it surpasses even the glory of the old covenant. The old covenant is being brought to an end. The new covenant is here to replace it. So we have just kind of done a survey of the covenants. There's much more to say here about the covenants and especially about the new covenant itself. But I do want us to end with this thought. Here's the gospel. The gospel is that through Jesus, God fulfilled His part of the covenants and our part of the covenants. So God says, I'll make a covenant with you. You be my people, I'll be your God. You'll be a kingdom of priests, keep this law, follow these rituals, and the people can't do it. We know the history of the Old Testament. That's what it is. It's one failure after another. Try to find a place in the Old Testament where the people of God actually were obedient. It's hard to do. It's every time they get a chance to be disobedient, they're disobedient. And so Jesus comes along, perfectly fulfills the Mosaic covenant, and fulfills all the promises of the other covenant. So God says, in a covenant, I have my part, you have your part. But after 1,500 years of us not being able to do our part, God says, I'll do them both. I will become a man, and I will fulfill your part of the covenant so that I can also fulfill my part of the covenant and bless all of those who are united to Christ and receive the blessings, the covenant blessings that He has earned.